This is Daniel Simon at Baton Rouge Community College. This is my second lecture on the 19th century and the rise of nationalism. And mostly of this lecture we'll be talking about 19th century Russia. I also will be talking about the Crimean War, which happened in about the mid-19th century. Mostly we'll talk about Russia, though. Russia will eventually weaken in the 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars. But before that happened, really the peak of Russia's power came under Emperor Alexander I, who was the Czar of Russia from 1801 to 1825. Alexander I was the son of Emperor Paul I. He was also a grandson of Catherine the Great. He's really considered one of their greatest czars, and mostly Alexander's known for was, of course, defeating Napoleon. Of course, in 1812, when Napoleon invaded Russia, and then, of course, he also led the coalition forces against Napoleon in 1813, 1814. He helped, them win pretty much the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig. And then Alexander was the one that marched in with the coalition forces when they took Paris and forced Napoleon in exile in 1814. He also had a lot of influence on the Congress of Vienna. He worked with Metternich to kind of ensure the whole status quo of conservative monarchs being put back on the throne, and pretty much helped to put the Bourbons back on the throne, although Alexander really didn't like the Bourbon dynasty that much. But he was, involved in doing that, and pretty much suppressed anything to do with liberalism, nationalism throughout Europe. And by the end of his reign, he became like more of a staunch conservative when he died in 1825. Now, continuing after his death, Alexander I had two brothers. He had a younger brother named Constantine. He's spelled with a C or K. And then you had also another one named Nicholas, later called Nicholas I. Constantine, in 1823, renounced the throne. He didn't want to become czar. And so the throne passed to Nicholas I. However, that created conflicts in Russia because Constantine was more liberal versus Nicholas, who was more conservative. There were officers in the Russian army that wanted Constantine to actually be the ruler instead. So it created a secession conflict in 1825. This became known as the Decembrist Revolt, and took place in December 1825, and about 3,000 Russian officers rebelled against Nicholas after he became czar. And they marched on St. Petersburg, and in what is Peter's Square, they held kind of like a demonstration against Nicholas I's government. And Nicholas was first forced to call out Russian troops to put it down, and a bunch of them were either killed or arrested by Nicholas, the officers that were protesting. And a bunch of them were put on trial for it, and some were sentenced to death. And then some were even sent to Siberia. That's something that the czars started doing kind of in the 19th century. Anybody that was against the czar's government was sent to Siberia. And it continues later, down to, the communism, when the Bolsheviks take over, like Lenin, Stalin will do the same thing also as well. So pretty much Nicholas I was a staunch conservative, probably the most staunch conservative Czar of Russia in the 19th century, and so very little reforming was going on in Russia. I think the only Czar I'll get to later that actually tries to do anything is Alexander II, which we'll get to him later. So that's pretty much what happened under Nicholas at the beginning. Now, they did have, of course, the most famous thing that happened under Nicholas, which I'll talk about, which is the Crimean War, which happened between 1853 to 56. This was a major war, probably the most famous major war in Europe in the mid-19th century. There aren't too many wars fought in the 19th century. It was kind of a peaceful period because of the age of Metternich. And like you had that war, and I think the Franco-Prussian War. I think those may be the two most famous wars that happened in the 19th century in Europe. Of course, in America, they had the American Civil War, which was pretty bloody. But the Crimean War was mostly a war which pitted Russia versus Britain and France and the Ottoman Empire. So they were kind of outnumbered in the war. It was a war that lasted around 3 years. And why it happened, there's different causes of it. There's several causes of why it broke out. One, there was a dispute, believe it or not, over religion that dealt with Christian minorities in the Holy Land, where Palestine or Israel is now. And you had differences where you had Catholics versus Orthodox Christians. And, Russia was Orthodox, France is mostly Catholic. And there was a kind of a dispute over these minorities that were under the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. So that was one issue that caused it. Other issues was the British were big supporters of the Ottoman Empire. They were kind of allied with them, mostly because of trade. They were kind of worried if the Ottoman Empire collapsed and all that or broke up, that would cause a lot of problems in the Middle East. And I think we had mentioned about this before, but Nicholas I of Russia had made the comment that the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. There was, like a sick man dying in a bed, and the Russians, wanted to take advantage of it, and so they I think what Russia wanted to do was seize land that was Ottoman land, which was mostly on the western Black Sea side, where Romania is, Bulgaria, I think, too. They took advantage of that and eventually did try to take that, which they did part of it. And that's part of what caused the war also as well. Britain and France were also worried about Far East trade because Russia was expanding eastward. They were colonizing the East in the 19th century. That kind of played a major role because, Britain's worried about China and other stuff in the East where they have trade and so on. And so that was another cause of it, and all that. But the war mostly broke out because of conflicts in Romania, like west of the Black Sea, and it also, I think, conflicts on the Black Sea itself, like naval engagements between the Russian and the Turks. And that's how the war started in 1853. Well, the Europeans and the Turks realized that the only way they were going to really knock the Russians out of the war is if they invade the Crimea, which, if you know about, is a peninsula that's on the southern Black Sea. You can kind of see, I gave you all a map, I think, in the lectures, the PDF lectures, and you can see the Black Sea on the far western side of that map, and the Crimea is on the northern part of it. So they use mostly, their navies, Britain, France, and the Turks, to bring up forces up through the Black Sea and to land on the Crimean Peninsula. And they did this starting in September of 1854. And it led to the most important famous aspect of the war, which was the siege of Sevastopol. Sevastopol is the capital of the Crimea. It's where they have the main port of the Black Sea fleet of the Russian Navy. Still does today now. And the siege would last a year. I think it goes from September 1854 to September 1855. And it was the bloodiest aspect of the war. I think the Russians would end up having like 100,000 men or more killed in the war. It was like a couple million men that fought there in the war. There was different battles that were part of the Crimean War. The one that was the most famous is the Battle of Balaclava, which took place on October 25th, 1854. This was a battle on the Crimean Peninsula where the Russian forces tried to counterattack the coalition forces that were on the peninsula. Mostly involved the British fighting against them. And the British counterattacked it with cavalry charges. And it was later immortalized in a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson, you may have heard of. That's called The Charge of the Light Brigade. It was like one of their big battles the British were involved in. It's the most famous battle probably of the whole, war. You may have heard about it or read the poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. One more thing about the war too. The war was known for being one of the first modernized wars in history. It was famous for different things. First of all, it was one of the first wars where railroads were used because, like in the early 19th century, countries started developing railroads, especially in the West, and the West, like France, Britain mostly, used railroads to transport a lot of their men to the battlefield and also to transport, against some goods across Europe. So that was one way they used it for. Russia had some railroads in the West, Western Russia, but they were limited. I don't think they had too many railroads, and it really hurt them. They think that was one of the causes of why Russia didn't do so well in the war, because they didn't have railroads. Also, it was one of the first wars where they had telecommunications, and the telegraph was first used. And you may have heard of Samuel Morse and some of these other inventors that developed it. But they basically back home, like in Britain, France, they kind of knew what was going on because of the telegraph. And then they could figure out like who's wounded, who's gotten killed, and a lot of this they could publish in the newspapers and all that. And so before that, you had to mail a letter, which would take forever, by ship or something like that to get there. That might take weeks. Remember the War of 1812? They didn't find out about the war being over till like a month or so. So people knew right away what happened that week. So also, yeah, this war was the first war where it was photographed, like a photograph war. They didn't have video or anything like that, like they do later. I think World War I is the first war where they have actually, video of them actual fighting and all that. A lot of the photographs show the battlefield. They also depict a lot of the soldiers wearing their uniforms or on their horses. That's something that's kind of unique about the Crimean War itself. And then, yeah, it's one of those first wars that where modern nursing was supposedly developed. And, of course, there was a nurse who was from England, you may have heard of, named Florence Nightingale. I've got a picture of her right here. They consider her to be the founder of modern nursing, and she was actually an English nurse that was known for setting up hospitals and training nurses to treat, wounded soldiers from the war, and so she was very important, Florence Nightingale. And they say Florence Nightingale also set up the first nursing school, which I think was after the war in 1860, when that is. And so she became real famous. That's her picture right there. I don't know what we can do about the virus, though. You know anything? I don't know. But anyway, but she's the one that started modern nursing. So I guess they dress differently now, nurses. So anyway, but that's basically what that is. So that's mostly the Crimean War, the history of it. Now, the war ended in 1856. The Russians, by the way, had to abandon the Black Sea Fleet because they were losing the war. So they actually evacuated from the Crimean Peninsula. And before they evacuated, they scuttled their Black Sea Fleet. They really just sank it all. And so that was really an embarrassment for the Russians. And I think with the treaty that ended it later, they couldn't even have ships on the Black Sea for a long time because of that. And Russia was really humiliated by that war. They think it's one of the wars that, in a sense, caused the decline of Russia in the 19th century. They'll later keep losing wars. Like they lose a war to, I think, Japan in the early 1900s. In World War I, they got beat pretty good, too, by the Germans. So they don't do very well, Russia, later. So it's part of why the lack of reforms and all that later, too, that lead to the Bolshevik seizing power, and we got the rise of communism under the Soviet Union. But we'll get to that later on all that. All right, then, of course, we're going to move on to this other czar we're going to talk about, which is Emperor Alexander II. He's like the only czar, really, in the 19th century that tried to do any reforms to Russia. And he came to power in 1856 after, Nicholas died. 1855, 56, I think, is when Nicholas died. And Alexander was known for a lot of great reforms. The biggest thing, of course, that he's known for, here's his picture right here I've got. That's actually him, Alexander the Second. I love that beard, you know, it's awesome. That's the kind of style, I guess, they had in those days. Nice uniform also as well. But he's like a basic reformer, and he's known for, of course, ending serfdom. He would free the serfs in Russia, which was done in 1861. And because of it, he got a nickname. He was called Alexander the Liberator, the Czar Liberator, called all kinds of names. I think in America they even called him, because of, you know, I guess later because of Abraham Lincoln, you know, freeing the slaves, he was called the Russian Lincoln. I think that's what they called him, or something like that. Anyway, the date that the serfs were all freed, by the way, was on March 3rd, 1861. He issued this thing called it's called the Emancipation Manifesto. It's like a part of an edict that he gave. And what it did was it freed all household and private serfs. They were all throughout Russia, which included, by the way, about 23 million or something like that, may have been the amount at the time that were actually freed. And they were given full rights as citizens. I think they could marry officially. And then they also were given like the right to buy land or get land somehow if they could afford it. Some of them couldn't even afford it. And so some of them couldn't even get anything. And the other thing he did too that was famous, he created this thing called the Zemstva system. It was an institution of local government that he created throughout Russia, and especially for like all the peasants to have them some kind of form of government. It was like this peasant communal type system of government, which was based on mostly peasant communes or village communes that were all throughout Russia. And all the peasants held their land in like communal ownership, basically. And they called it different names. Some called the lowest form of it was called the MIR, and they have another name, which was Obshchina. I think it's how they spell it. I think it's spelled different ways, but MIR I think meant society is what it meant. They used this from like the 1860s all the way up to, I think, 1905 or somewhere around there. And it's like it's kind of like a form of commune, is kind of was like a village commune. And so each peasant family could have so much land that they could grow crops and so on. Later it was replaced with the Stolypin reforms, which were reforms in Russia in the early 1900s to create more of capitalist farming, to make the farmers into capitalists, because it wasn't the other one wasn't as successful as maybe capitalist farming, basically. And they used that to World War I, and then what happened was the Bolsheviks seized power, and they got rid of it, and they went more to like back to the commune. Like collectivism, that's what they called it actually, collective farming, and that was a total disaster too, which we'll talk about later, which Stalin tries to put in. I think a lot of people starve in Russia because of that. They believed that he also was going to try to create a constitution, because there was a talk of creating a constitution for the country, maybe a constitutional monarchy, I think is what I think he was kind of going to. He was still like an absolutist, Alexander II, but he got assassinated before that could happen in 1881. Alexander II was a modernizer too. He modernized and industrialized the country, mostly in Western Russia, and he began building a lot of railroads throughout Russia. Like in 1860, Russia only had about 1,200 miles of railroads in the country. And by the time he died, close to the early 1880s, Russia had 15,000 miles of railroads. So it had like 40, 50 times more railroads, under him by the time he went out. So Russia's starting to modernize. It's still rural pretty much, especially way in the east. Siberia and all that. It's really, it's still pretty much like it is in a lot of areas in eastern Russia. And but anyway, so he died in 1881. He was actually assassinated by these. They were like a bunch of radicals that killed him. There was a radical group called the People's Will. It was dubbed, and it was, I think, in St. Petersburg where it took place, I believe. But anyway, they threw a couple bombs at him. First bomb missed him, and he was like, "Oh my God, thank God it missed me." The second bomb got him, though it blew his legs off almost. Poor guy. And I think they had him later executed, but he was killed, and so his son took over, which would be Alexander III. So Alexander III would rule next. He was a reactionary to Alexander II. So there were talk of, having a constitution. He shelved it pretty much. And so under Alexander III, he began also, he continued, even though he was a staunch conservative, he did continue the modernization of Russia under him. And there's one thing I have in the notes I gave you that was real famous about Alexander III. He was the one that started the Trans-Siberian Railway network in Russia, which started in 1881. It was finished during World War I around 1916. So it took them about 20-something years to build it. It was all built by hand, about this, the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And it's, of course, close to 6,000 miles long. It starts in Moscow in western Russia and goes all the way into Siberia. It actually originally linked up with Lake Baikal, which is in Siberia. But the railroad then goes all the way to Vladivostok, which is on the Pacific Ocean, basically. So the longest railroad in the world. It's actually a little longer than 6,000 miles because it has other railroads that connect to it. There was one I think it went, I guess it still does, goes to it goes to Kiev, Ukraine. There's other branches that go into Mongolia, China, like northern China, and like maybe Manchuria and all that. And then also there's one that actually goes down, like a railroad link that goes down into North Korea where Pyongyang is. I think the total miles with all those other connections is like 10,000 miles. If you add in the areas that are outside of Russia. But around 6,000 miles is how long it is. It's amazing. It goes through 8 time zones. So I think it takes you like 2-3 days to if you go from Moscow to Vladivostok. It will literally take 2-3 days. I think it's got 74 stops I've read about. 74 stops from Moscow to Vladivostok. They do think that the railway system was based off of a famous highway system that was in Russia called the Siberian Route or the Siberian Highway that was built in the 1800s. And that's the route that they eventually build the railroad on. So it kind of follows it. And there's actually a highway system that actually, I think it follows it as it goes eastward. So anyway, just kind of talking about that. Another thing about Alexander III, he had a nickname, I believe. I think some people later called him the Peacemaker. I think that's what they call him, Alexander the Peacemaker. Maybe he was called. He was called that because he was known for trying to make peace with foreign countries. Like I think under him there were very few wars that broke out. It was a very peaceful period under that period of Russia. And I think he made like kind of an alliance during that time with France. Because France, Britain, and Russia start kind of forming an alliance together, which is later called the Triple Entente. That's the alliance that'll fight the Germans in World War I. So he's kind of one of the guys that helped kind of develop it, Then we have, of course, one more Czar of Russia, which we won't talk too much about today. We'll get to him later when we get more to World War I and the Russian Revolution. But you got Emperor Nicholas II. He's the so-called last Tsar of Russia, as they call him now. He'll be Tsar from 1894 to 1917. And it's under him that Russia has a lot of problems that occurs. A lot of it was due to a lack of reforms because, his father before Alexander III was a staunch conservative, didn't really want to change Russia. Nicholas II was the same way. He really thought he was an absolutist. And so what happened under him was a lot of revolutions broke out. There's two of them. There was one later we'll talk about, which is the Russian Revolution of 1905. A lot of that was due to a lack of reforms, also due to the Russo-Japanese War, where the Russians got beat bad in the Far East, especially in the Pacific there, when the Japanese sank their navy in the East. Bad. And so that created that revolution. And also World War One, of course, was the other thing that happened under Nicholas II, and we'll get to it later, but Russia suffers a lot of massive defeats against Germany and the Central Powers in World War One. Germany lost a lot of, Russia also lost a lot of men. They were killed and wounded in the war, a couple million or more. That took a toll on the country, and they were also blockaded because the Turks were in the war on the Central Power side, and so that helped cause the Russian Revolution of 1917, along with all the lack of reforms. And later, the Tsar was forced to step down. That ended the whole Romanov dynasty. And then, as you know, later, the Bolsheviks, under Vladimir Lenin, seized power. They took over the country and formed the Soviet Union out of it. And the Soviet Union, became a communist state later. So we'll get more into that later, around World War I and the Russian Revolution. But poor guy, you know about Emperor Nicholas II. He gets later, his whole family, he and his family are all shot by the Bolsheviks. They're all killed. So it's kind of a tragic story, what kind of happened to the last Czar of Russia. But that'll be something we'll get to later. Pretty much that ends this lecture on the 19th century. Our next lecture later, we're going to be getting into, we'll talk about the Industrial Revolution, the rise of socialism, and I'll also talk about the cause of World War I. So that'll be week 3 of this online lecture series on YouTube. Okay? That's it.